Hey everyone, welcome back to Medieval Historian. Tonight's video is not for the faint of heart. We're diving deep, literally, into the brutal underworld of medieval prisons. This isn't your typical knight in shining armor fairy tale. This is the dark, damp, rat-infested reality of what happened when the dungeon door slammed shut behind you. Torture, starvation, disease, and despair weren't just threats. They were the daily routine. Now, let's be real. In today's world, even the roughest prisons come with things like electricity, plumbing, maybe even a mattress. But back in the Middle Ages, prison wasn't just where you served your sentence. It was the sentence. No trial, no rights, and if the rats didn't get you first, the torture rack probably would. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. You guys make this journey even more amazing. Now, let's begin. This is why being a medieval prisoner was a living nightmare. Imagine being dragged from your bed in the middle of the night. No explanation, no defense, just fists, chains, and the sound of a lock you won't hear open again. They throw you into a wagon that stinks of death and rot, and by the time it stops, your new life has already begun, if you can call it a life. The dungeon isn't a room. It's a tomb with a door, a hole in the ground carved from rock, darker than midnight and colder than a corpse. There are no beds, no torches, no windows, just stone, moisture, and air so thick you taste mold when you breathe. You don't walk inside, you fall, or get shoved, and then the door slams behind you. That sound? It's the last full sentence you'll hear for a while. Your cell is small, barely enough to lie down. The walls sweat, the floors wet. Straw, if there is any, is soaked with filth. Rats own the place. You're a guest in their house now. And the smell? It's a living thing. A blend of urine, blood, vomit, and despair cooked into every inch of the space. Light doesn't reach you. The dark presses in so thick it feels like another layer of skin. You stop blinking, stop caring. You lose track of time. Minutes stretch like days. Days collapse into blurs. Hunger doesn't knock, it pounds. Your stomach chews itself while your head spins with echoes of screams. Some near, some far. You pray they're not coming from you. Yet, you're not alone. The cell is shared. Maybe with another prisoner. Maybe with 5. Maybe with someone who died yesterday and hasn't been noticed yet. You can't see them, but you can hear them. Breathing, coughing, crying. You learn their rhythms before you ever know their names. Privacy? Gone? Dignity? That left with the clothes they took. You eat in filth. Relieve yourself in a corner. Sleep, if you're lucky, in shifts, curled tight to avoid the cold and the rats. Everything is pain or waiting for pain. And the worst part? No one tells you why you're here. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you insulted the wrong noble. Maybe someone lied. It doesn't matter. The dungeon isn't interested in justice. It's interested in breaking you. You don't wait for freedom. You wait for the next scream, the next shuffle of keys, the next bowl of rot they call food. You count the drips from the ceiling, the scratches in the wall, the parts of yourself that stop working, one by one. Welcome to the dungeon. You don't survive it. You adapt or you disappear. In modern times, innocence is protected. Or at least it tries to be. You get a chance to explain. You get a lawyer. You have rights. But in the Middle Ages, rights weren't something you had. They were things the powerful chose to withhold from you. Back then, Just being accused of a crime was often enough to ruin your life. Evidence wasn't required. Testimonies were often based on superstition, hearsay, or straight-up spite. You could be imprisoned because your neighbor didn't like the way you looked at their cow, because the local priest had a dream where you turned into a frog, or because someone had to take the fall for a crime a noble's son actually committed. It didn't matter if you were guilty or innocent. What mattered was who accused you, who you were, and who you weren't. Nobles, they got fines. Priests, they got forgiveness. Peasants, you got the dungeon. It was that simple. Your social status dictated your fate. If you couldn't afford to bribe someone, or if you weren't useful as a pawn, then justice wasn't blind. It was just cruel. The worst part? You didn't even get a trial most of the time. And when you did, it was more performance than process. The goal wasn't to uncover the truth. It was to make you confess. Not voluntarily, of course. That was rare. Instead, they used what they called interrogation, which was a generous way of saying they tortured you until you said what they wanted to hear. Denying the charges didn't help. It just meant more pain. And the more pain you endured, the more suspicious you became. After all, only a guilty person would suffer this much to avoid telling the truth, right? And if you did break and confess to something you didn't do, congratulations. You just validated the entire system. And guess what? Now they had grounds to go after your family too. Guilt didn't stop with you. It bled into everyone you touched. Your wife might be accused of conspiring with you, your children seen as tainted. Your name dragged through the mud until it vanished completely. Confession wasn't an escape. It was the final nail in your coffin. And still, people confessed. Because the pain was unimaginable. The devices weren't symbolic, they were efficient. You were stretched until your joints dislocated, crushed until bones shattered, burned until skin peeled. All while being told that your suffering was a path to divine truth. Being innocent didn't save you. It just made your sentence longer, crueler, and more confusing. You'd spend weeks, months, years wondering what went wrong, until you realized that in this world, nothing had to go wrong. Just existing was enough. In a time when hierarchy was sacred and your last name mattered more than your life, simply existing near someone with a title could be considered a punishable offense. In the Middle Ages, you didn't need to steal, kill, or commit treason to land yourself in a dungeon. You just had to be in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong face. If a nobleman was having a bad day and didn't like the look you gave him, that was enough. Off to the dungeon. If a baron's horse got spooked and you happened to be walking nearby, guess who gets blamed? If a priest's sermon didn't go well and he remembered your skeptical eyebrow in the crowd, that raised brow might cost you your freedom. The legal system wasn't just flawed, it was weaponized. Nobles could accuse anyone of anything and rarely needed to explain themselves. Why? Because they were nobles. That was the explanation. Their word was law, their mood was justice, and their whims were sentencing. And peasants? You had no voice, no protection, no right to protest. If a lord's servant claimed you said something seditious, even as a joke or in a moment of drunken frustration, congratulations. You were now a threat to the crown, or to the church, or to someone's fragile ego. But it wasn't just the nobles. The church had its own sacred shield of power. Speak ill of a clergyman, question the teachings, or, God forbid, fail to tithe your already starving family's last coin. That could be twisted into heresy. And heresy wasn't just frowned upon, it was feared, it was contagious, it was hunted, which meant you were no longer a peasant with doubts. You were a spiritual infection that needed to be cleansed, preferably in chains or fire. There were entire classes of people who were more vulnerable to these kinds of accusations. Foreigners, widows, healers, midwives, outspoken women, the poor, the disabled. Anyone who didn't fit neatly into society's expectations was a suspect in waiting. Their very existence made the powerful uncomfortable, and that discomfort often translated into accusations that could never be disproven. You might think keeping your head down would protect you. Smile, bow, avoid attention. But in the medieval world, invisibility didn't mean safety. It meant weakness. And weakness was an open invitation for exploitation. If you owned land and someone wealthier wanted it, suddenly you were a tax evader. If you had something rare or valuable, like literacy or herbal knowledge, you were a sorcerer, a threat, a criminal. And it didn't matter if everyone in your village knew the accusation was nonsense. It didn't matter if you had witnesses or a spotless reputation. The moment a noble or cleric decided you were guilty, you were. The truth was irrelevant. The system wasn't built to find the truth. It was built to protect those who already had power. Everyone else? You were expendable. So no, your crime wasn't theft or murder. It wasn't blasphemy or rebellion. Your crime was existing in a world where the powerful saw your life as disposable. Your crime was breathing near a noble and breathing the wrong way. Let's say, miraculously, you're not tossed into the dungeon immediately. You're going to be questioned. That might sound like a small blessing, a chance to speak, a moment to explain. But don't get your hopes up. In the Middle Ages, questioning wasn't about uncovering facts. It was about confirming suspicion through agony. Your trial didn't begin in a courtroom. It began on a table. And it wasn't your voice that determined your fate. It was your screams. They called it trial by ordeal or interrogation. It sounds almost clinical, civil. But what it really meant was that you were tied, clamped, stretched, crushed, burned, or beaten until you confessed. And the beauty of the system? The more you screamed, the more guilty you looked. The more you stayed silent, the more they turned up the pain. It was a game of agony with no winning move. Because the people questioning you weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for submission. Torture wasn't used sparingly. It was a first resort. Accused of theft? Let's try the thumbscrews. Suspected of lying? Onto the rack you go. Rumors of heresy? How about the strappado, where your arms are tied behind your back and you're hoisted by a rope, then dropped suddenly to dislocate your shoulders? Sometimes they called it God's judgment, as if pain were divine truth made to flesh. If you were innocent, surely God would protect you. Except, he never did. And if you died from the torture? Well, that was just unfortunate. But hey, you probably deserved it anyway, right? Inquisitors and officials had an arsenal. The iron boot, where they crushed your foot until the bones exploded. The pear of anguish, inserted into your mouth or worse, then expanded until tissue tore. The breast ripper, used on women accused of adultery or witchcraft. The iron chair, heated until glowing, then sat upon. The rack, stretching your body past its natural limits until bones dislocated, ligaments snapped, and your own body betrayed you with every pop and crack. But it wasn't just physical pain, it was psychological warfare. You were isolated beforehand, starved, stripped, mocked, promised mercy if you just confessed, then punished harder once you did. And the worst part? Your torture didn't end when you broke. It ended when your body broke. When you lost consciousness, lost control of your bladder, or lost the ability to scream. Only then did they pause, just long enough to start again tomorrow. Some were tortured to death. Others were kept alive, barely, so they could be paraded in front of others as a warning. Their twisted limbs, haunted eyes, and slow, shambling steps were reminders of what happens to those who refuse the truth. This wasn't justice, it was theater, a cruel ritual dressed up in holy language and official robes. The goal wasn't fairness, it was fear. Because if everyone feared the dungeon, the nobles, the priests, and the king, then no one would question the system. No one would speak. And that silence, that was the real victory. If there was one word that could turn your life from difficult to downright doomed in the Middle Ages, it was witch. Being accused of witchcraft wasn't just a charge, it was a curse. One whispered rumor, one suspicious glance, one bad harvest blamed on your presence, and you could find yourself bound in chains, tortured, and burned alive. All for nothing more than bad luck or being too different. Witchcraft accusations weren't random, they were strategic. In a world where understanding was limited and fear was currency, witch became a label used to explain the unexplainable. If someone's child got sick and died, witch. If livestock miscarried or crops failed, witch. If a storm hit the village right after you said it would rain, definitely a witch. It didn't take proof, it took gossip, fear, envy, a nudge from the wrong person at the wrong time. Women were the most common targets, especially widows, healers, midwives, or anyone who had herbal knowledge or simply lived alone. Being old, outspoken, unmarried, or too clever made you suspicious. Being poor made you vulnerable. And being helpful, like treating fevers with herbs, well, that was practically a confession. Once accused, the system didn't need evidence. Your trial was already underway the moment someone said your name. There were the tests. Drownings, for example. You'd be thrown into water, hands and feet tied. If you sank, you were innocent, but probably dead. If you floated, clearly the water rejected you, meaning you were a witch. Either way, you didn't win. Other tests involved inspecting your body for witch marks, birthmarks, scars, or moles believed to be signs of demonic pacts. If they found one, that was all they needed. You might even be shaved head to toe just to find one. No dignity, no privacy, no humanity. And of course, there was torture. Because witches didn't usually confess on their own. So they were helped, on the rack, with hot irons, with thumb screws, or simply with sleep deprivation and starvation until the mind broke and the words came out. And if you confessed, that only made things worse. Now they had names. Fellow witches, a coven, more people to arrest, more fuel for the fire, literally. They'd burn you for purging your soul, then burn others for knowing you. The worst part? You couldn't defend yourself. You weren't allowed to speak in your own defense most of the time, and if you did, it was used against you. Arguing meant rebellion. Crying meant guilt. Silence meant cunning. Anything you did or didn't do could and would be used to prove you were in league with the devil. Once that label stuck, witch, it didn't matter what you had done. Your fate was already sealed, and if you survived the trial, it was often only to be executed publicly. Strangled, burned, hanged. Whatever the local flavor of cleansing demanded. And crowds would cheer. Because they'd been told that your death made them safer. So no, being accused of witchcraft wasn't just bad luck. It was a death sentence wrapped in hysteria and tied with a bow of injustice. And the more human you were, emotional, imperfect, unique, the more likely they were to burn you for it. Once the accusations are done, the torture administered, and your name etched into the record of guilt, you are no longer a person. You are a prisoner. And that means you're finally sent to your new home, a place designed not to hold you safely, but to break you utterly. Your cell. A space so small, so hostile, and so unforgiving it feels less like a room and more like a tomb someone forgot to finish burying. You aren't guided gently in. You're thrown, sometimes dragged, maybe carried by the arms while your legs flop behind, barely attached to your pain-racked body. And then you're dropped, like meat, onto a stone floor that hasn't seen sunlight in generations. The door slams, the lock turns, the light vanishes, and you're alone. But not really, not for long. Because these cells weren't individual. Privacy didn't exist. You shared your confinement with others. People who had been there longer, who were sicker, more broken, more desperate, or worse, others who saw you as competition, for air, for space, for sanity. The cell stinks of mildew, rotting food, human waste, and the lingering presence of whatever disease killed the last person who slept where you now lie. The floor? Mud, if you're lucky. If not, it's soaked stone, cold and wet year-round. You might be chained to the wall. You might be forced to sit upright against stone that tears through your clothes and into your skin. There's no straw, no mattress, no blanket. Just your body, bruised, bleeding, exposed, and the filth that will become your bed, your seat, your bathroom. The darkness is complete. You can't see your hand in front of your face. You learn quickly to listen, to every shuffle, cough, or footstep in the hallway. Because those sounds are the only indicators of time, movement, or incoming torment. There's no schedule, no meal times. If you're fed, it's without warning. A crust of bread thrown through the bars, maybe a bowl of pottage if you're lucky, but don't ask what's in it. It smells like something scraped from under a latrine and tastes worse. Water? A slimy bucket? If it's not green, it's brown. And if it's clear, it's a miracle, and probably not meant for you. The cell isn't silent. The other prisoners cry out in their sleep, or mutter endlessly. Some hum, some scream, some never speak at all. And then there are the ones who laugh. Quiet, broken laughter in the dark that lets you know the cell has finally eaten them alive. Every hour here is a choice. Give in or hold on. Most don't choose. Their minds slip, their bodies follow. They stop talking, stop eating, stop moving. They just rot, slowly, until someone remembers to remove the corpse. Or they don't. And you wake up beside it, days later, wondering how long the stench will cling to you. You don't sleep in this cell. You pass out, you collapse. You twitch in the night and jerk awake to find your hand resting in something warm and unspeakable. This isn't a place to rest. It's a place to unlearn being human, and that's exactly what it was designed to do. There's nothing quite like the exhaustion that comes after being chained, starved, interrogated, and dropped into a hole that pretends to be a room. But once the adrenaline fades and the pain dulls into background noise, your body begs for rest. Not sleep, just relief. Just something soft beneath you, something warm around you. But in a medieval prison, comfort wasn't just unavailable, it was an alien concept. There were no mattresses, no blankets, and certainly no concern for your spine. The idea of humane treatment hadn't even been invented yet. Your bed was the floor. Cold, wet, uneven. It could be dirt packed so tight it cracked like old parchment or bare stone that pulled every degree of heat from your skin like it was trying to kill you quietly. Some prisons gave straw if you were lucky, but it wasn't clean, it wasn't dry, and it certainly wasn't replaced. What little bedding existed was soaked with urine, blood, and rot. It crawled, with lice, with fleas, with bugs that didn't even have names yet. You didn't lay down in it, you surrendered to it. and it welcomed you like a coffin made of filth. Your body never fully rests in a place like that. Your muscles stay tense, bracing against cold. Your joints scream with every shift. The pressure points on your hips, your shoulders, your knees. They go numb, then burn. You'd kill for something as simple as a pillow, but instead you use your arms or whatever rag you're still wearing. If you're wearing anything at all. Prison clothes? Luxury. Most prisoners were kept in whatever they were arrested in, torn, thin, unwashed, or nothing at all. And then there's the smell, so constant it feels physical, like another weight pressing down on your chest. Every breath you take while lying down brings the stench closer. You're nose to nose with whatever filth the last prisoner left behind. Sweat, feces, pus, rats, the sour sting of dried vomit, the fetid sweetness of rot. It clings to your skin, soaks into your hair, nestles in the corners of your mouth. You can't escape it. You breathe through it. You sleep in it. You get used to lying on your side to avoid pressure on open wounds. But that leads to cramps, to stiffness, to infections. You try lying on your back, but the cold seeps straight into your spine. On your stomach? That's just an invitation for every crawling thing in the cell to use you as a bridge. You twist and shift all night, like a wounded animal trying to die discreetly. And worst of all, the guards didn't care. They saw your misery and walked past it. If you asked for straw, they laughed. If you begged, they spit. Sometimes, if they were feeling generous, they'd throw a bucket of water on you. Not to clean you, just to watch you squirm. In medieval prisons, sleep wasn't rest. It was survival. One twitch, one rat bite, one cough too close to your ear could jolt you awake in terror. You didn't wake up refreshed. You woke up worse. Sorer, sicker, more confused, because in the absence of comfort, even rest became dangerous, and night was just another punishment you had to survive. You don't realize how much you need sunlight until it's gone. Not just for warmth or light or vitamin D, but for sanity. In the outside world, the sun rises and sets, giving structure to your day, anchoring your mind in time. In a medieval dungeon, there is no sunrise, no sunset, no time at all, just darkness, thick, heavy, and absolute. Most prison cells weren't built above ground with bars and a view. They were carved into stone, buried beneath castles, wedged beneath city walls, or shoved into old ruins. The deeper, the better. No windows, no airflow, no hint of the outside world. Your cell might have a hole in the wall, if you're lucky, but even that was rare, and usually stuffed with rotting straw or sealed with wood to keep the weather out, which meant you could spend months, years, never seeing a single shaft of natural light. The darkness didn't stay outside your cell. It crept inside you. Your eyes stopped adjusting. Your sense of day and night disappeared. You slept when your body gave out. You woke when someone screamed. You forgot what morning felt like, what color looked like. Your dreams, when they came, became more vivid than reality, and reality more shapeless than dreams. There were no torches provided in cells. Fire was reserved for the corridors, for guards. You weren't trusted with flame, not even a candle. So you lived in pitch black, where every object was discovered by touch, every person by sound, and every threat by instinct. You learned to count the passing of time by drops of water or the number of rats that scurried across your feet per hour. Madness wasn't an if, it was a when. The lack of sunlight also turned your body against you. Your skin grew pale, sickly. Your bones ached more. Your immune system weakened. Cuts stopped healing. You bruised easier. You stopped producing certain hormones, lost weight, lost muscle, lost hair. Eventually, prisoners didn't even look like people anymore. Just pale, sunken-eyed ghosts of the people they used to be. And the cruel irony? When you were brought into the light, usually to be whipped, marched, or executed, it hurt. The sun you once longed for now blinded you, burned you, made you squint and cower like a creature of the deep. And the people above ground looking at you, they didn't see a victim. They saw a monster, filthy, Madam Rabid, proof that justice had been served. The loss of sunlight wasn't just a deprivation, it was a weapon. A slow, quiet way to destroy your mind while pretending nothing was happening. Because pain is loud, blood is dramatic. But darkness is subtle. It seeps in through your eyes, settles in your mind, and eats you alive from the inside out. You might think prison is solitary, just you, the darkness, and your regrets. But in the Middle Ages, personal space was a luxury no one could afford. Most cells weren't made for individuals. They were pits into which people were tossed, stacked, and forgotten. You didn't have a roommate. You had dozens. Some alive, some barely, some possibly dead for days, and no one had noticed. There were no categories. You weren't separated by crime, age, health, or even gender. A thief could be locked in with a murderer, a child beside a plague victim, a nun accused of heresy next to a drunk who punched a guard. Rich or poor, man or woman, guilty or innocent, it didn't matter. Once inside, you were meat. And meat goes in the pit. You couldn't avoid your cellmates. The space didn't allow it. Your leg touched someone else's leg when you sat. When you lay down, you pressed against other bodies, some trembling, others feverish, and some ice cold. You'd flinch at every cough, every movement, every shuffle in the dark. But flinching only made you tired. So eventually, you stopped. Tensions ran high. You couldn't speak freely, because you didn't know who might sell you out for an extra scrap of bread. Paranoia seeped into every whispered conversation. Every ally could be a threat. Every moment of sleep a gamble. Some prisoners snapped, some lashed out, some tried to dominate the space with brute force. And if the guards noticed a fight, they usually didn't care. Sometimes they started them. The chaos entertained them. And dead prisoners needed fewer rations. Then came the illnesses. Cells were breeding grounds for disease. One man sneezing could doom everyone. But you couldn't escape. You'd watch, helpless, as someone coughed themselves into a fever, vomited into the straw, then collapsed. Their body lay beside you for hours or days until someone dragged it out. And the next day, someone else started coughing. There was no privacy, not to eat, not to sleep, not to cry, not even to relieve yourself. Buckets overflowed, walls were stained, bodies squatted where they could, sometimes inches from your head. The smell never faded, and neither did the sound. Moaning, muttering, begging, whispered prayers, delirious laughter, it all swirled in the cell like a dark fog, choking out the last pieces of your peace. Over time, you stopped looking at faces. You stopped asking names. You didn't want to know who you were pressed against, because they might die tomorrow. Or worse, you might. And the less you connected, the less it would hurt. This wasn't community. It was captivity at scale. A human zoo, caged without care, stripped of individuality. You weren't just sharing your cell with people. You were sharing it with their pain, their madness, their infections, and their ghosts. And every night you stayed alive was just another night closer to becoming one of them. After days in darkness, weeks without comfort, and months without kindness, you begin to learn something about survival. You take companionship where you can get it. And in the dungeon, that meant rats. Not in the storybook sense, not clever, pet-worthy, or symbolic. These were real rats, filthy, aggressive, endless, and in medieval prisons they were the only ones who visited you every single day. They came in droves. Fat, oily-bodied creatures with yellow teeth and slick, twitching tails. You could hear them before you saw them, skittering across the stone, squeaking through the walls, fighting in the corners. They lived here better than you did. They thrived. This was their territory. You were the invader. At first, you tried to push them away. You'd kick, scream, swat in the dark, but they always came back, hungrier, braver. They'd nibble at your food if you were lucky, at your feet if you weren't, at your open wounds if you passed out long enough. They didn't fear you. They watched you, waited. You weren't a person to them. You were just part of the ecosystem now. Sometimes they crawled over you in your sleep. Other times, you'd wake up to one sitting on your chest, staring into your eyes. The guards? They didn't care. If a prisoner screamed too loud about rats, they might come. Not to help, just to laugh. Sometimes they even threw rats into the cell on purpose. For fun. To punish. To break you one bite at a time. You learned to eat faster. To huddle your food close. To sleep curled tightly, limbs wrapped around yourself so they couldn't get under your clothes. But they always found a way. You'd hear the scratching beside your head, the chewing near your feet, and no, there was no such thing as safety anymore. And then came the psychological shift. You started talking to them, quietly, desperately, naming them, bargaining with them. The only living things who didn't demand your confession or plot your downfall. The only things that didn't care what you were accused of. Just that you were still warm. For many prisoners, rats became companions by default. The last disgusting thread of connection to something alive. They were company. They were the countdown. Because when the rats stopped coming, when even they stopped sniffing around your body, that's when you knew it was almost over. You hadn't made friends in prison. You hadn't formed bonds with your fellow captives. But the rats, they were always there, watching, waiting. And in the end, they were the only ones that stuck around. In the Middle Ages, the idea of prison food was simple. Keep you alive just enough to suffer longer. If you were waiting for a hearty stew or warm bread, you'd be better off chewing your own boot. Meals were not nourishment. They were reminders. You were forgotten, despised, and replaceable. And dinner? Dinner was a grotesque ritual of humiliation served cold, sometimes crawling, often moldy. When food arrived, it didn't come on a tray. There were no utensils, no plates, just a slop bucket, a wooden bowl if you were lucky, or a communal pile of something vaguely edible dumped on the floor. It was rarely consistent. Some days you got a crust of bread so hard it could double as a weapon. Other days you were handed a bowl of pottage, or something pretending to be. A congealed stew of old grains, water, and maybe a root vegetable if the season was generous. It smelled like it had already been eaten once. Meat? Not unless you count gristle or bone. Maybe a strip of salted fat if someone in the kitchens made a mistake. But more often, what you got was protein of the crawling kind. Bugs floating on the surface, maggots buried in the bread. If you picked them off, they came back. If you ate them, at least you got calories. The taste? Rancid, acrid, bitter. Like someone boiled down hopelessness and stirred it with a stick. You didn't chew food in prison, you endured it. Swallowing too fast gave you cramps. Waiting too long meant it got stolen. Meals were fights. You ate with your hands, your mouth, your body hunched over your prize like an animal. And if you dropped it, that was it. No refills, no second chances. Just hunger that dragged itself into the next day. And speaking of hunger, there was never enough. Prison rations were half starvation by design. A weak prisoner caused less trouble. A slow prisoner didn't run. A dying prisoner didn't complain. So they kept you just on the edge, every bite a flicker of survival that somehow made your suffering last longer. If you were fed once a day, that was good. If you missed a day, tough luck, complain, and you might miss the next 3. The food didn't just fail to help you, it hurt you. It weakened your stomach, gave you cramps, diarrhea, vomiting. You'd see people curl up after eating, holding their bellies, whispering curses or prayers, depending on what they believed in. Sometimes the food was spoiled enough to kill. Sometimes the guards added something extra, ashes, filth, even human waste, to punish, and you'd eat it, because there was no choice. Hunger didn't care about pride. Dinner time wasn't a relief. It was a battlefield where the only victory was surviving another day of slow, miserable digestion. In a world where life meant labor and prison meant rot, even your meals betrayed you. Your stomach growled not with desire, but with dread. Water, the essence of life, the simplest of needs, the most basic form of mercy. But in a medieval prison, it was just another tool of torment. When thirst hit, it didn't ask politely. It clawed through your throat like fire. Your lips cracked, your mouth dried into sand. Your body ached, your thoughts slowed, and your dreams became pools you'd never reach. And what did you have to quench it with? Not clean water, never that, just the slime. In many dungeons, water came in a bucket, filled at the start of the day, and left to ferment in the heat and filth. It was cloudy. Yellow, sometimes. Green, if you were unlucky. Frothy, if you were cursed. Floaters were standard. Hair, crumbs, rats, human waste. Whatever the guards decided to ignore that day. The bucket was communal. Everyone drank from it. Everyone spit in it, coughed over it, some bled into it. And still, you drank. There was no alternative. You couldn't ask for better. You couldn't refuse. Even prisoners with wounds on their faces dipped their mouths into that poison. Because dehydration doesn't care about dignity. It starts with headaches, dizziness, fatigue. Then your kidneys shut down. You hallucinate. You collapse. And if no one drags you out, you die. Sometimes the dungeon had a trickle of groundwater, a slimy stream from the wall or floor, black with mold. That was better. Not safe, but better. Rats drank from it. So did you, sometimes at the same time. If rain came and puddled in the corners, it was a celebration. Prisoners cupped their hands, even licked the stone. And then there was the punishment of thirst. Guards used it deliberately, as control, as a game. They'd withhold water until you begged. Sometimes they'd let you drink, just to kick the bucket over when you reached for it. Other times they'd give you salt, or vinegar, or urine, just to see the look on your face. Just to remind you that even the one thing you needed to live could be twisted into a joke. Disease, of course, flourished. Waterborne parasites, dysentery, cholera, fevers. You didn't drink to get better. You drank to not die yet. And you never drank with peace. Every swallow came with risk. Every sip with sickness. Every drop a gamble. Because in the prison cell, the water didn't save you, it mocked you. And slowly it killed you. In the medieval dungeon, disease wasn't a threat, it was a guarantee. You didn't wonder if you'd get sick. You wondered when. It wasn't about health or hygiene, because neither existed here. Disease was the wallpaper, the air you breathed, the handshake no one wanted but everyone received. It lived in the water, in the walls, in the bedding, in the people crammed beside you. It wasn't invisible. It was practically a roommate. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, bubonic plague, fevers that made your skin boil, infections that turned small cuts into open rot. You didn't catch one disease. You collected them. One day, your throat burned. The next, your eyes swelled shut. Then came the coughing. Then the blood. Then the trembling chills that left your teeth rattling like dice in a cursed game. It started slowly, like betrayal. A headache, a fever, a shiver. Then it moved faster. Sweats that soaked your clothes. Vomit that coated the floor. Pus from places you didn't know could leak. Your cellmates didn't flinch. They'd seen it before. You were now on a timeline. The ones who died quick were lucky. The ones who lingered, burning, moaning, hallucinating in the dark, they were the real horror. And there was no quarantine. Sick and healthy shared the same air, the same bowls, the same sleeping space. The dungeon wasn't divided by condition. If one person coughed, the rest followed. If one bled, it soaked into the shared straw. If one died, the body stayed. Hours, days, until it puffed up and burst, and only then did the guards care, because the stench started to rise through the floorboards above. You could feel the disease settle on your skin like a second layer. It made your joints ache, your breath short, your brain slow. Some prisoners forgot their names. Others forgot where they were. Some screamed for their mothers, long dead. Some laughed until they choked. And you watched it all, hoping you were just tired, just cold, just hungry. Anything but sick. But you were sick, you all were. There was no clean in this place, no sterile, no safe, just infection on top of infection, and death waiting for an opening. The cells weren't prisons. They were incubators. Dark, damp coffins that kept you alive just long enough to be contagious. It was never just about surviving the system. You had to survive your own body, your own breath, your own neighbors. And there were no masks, no medicine, no mercy. Just a slow, festering promise that in this place, sickness wasn't a visitor. It was the host. And you were the guest who would never leave. You're burning with fever. You're leaking from both ends. You can't see straight, can't speak, can't move. Your hands tremble. Your skin is hot, then cold, then hot again. You don't know what's real anymore. This is the point in any decent world where someone calls for help. A medic, a healer, a doctor, but you're in a medieval prison. There is no doctor, just death. And he doesn't knock, he walks right in. Medicine in this time wasn't primitive, it was punishment. If you were lucky, you got a priest who'd mutter a prayer while your body seized on the floor. If you were really lucky, a guard might throw a rag at you and grunt something that could be translated loosely as "wipe that up." But mostly, you were left alone to fight a battle your body had already lost. There were no bandages, no antiseptics, no treatments. A wound was either ignored until it festered or stabbed open with a dirty knife to let out the bad blood. Broken bones were left crooked. Infections were called divine judgment. Mental illness, possession, epilepsy, witchcraft. Everything wrong with you was your fault, your sin, your curse. And if you cried out enough, they might silence you. With a stick, a boot, a gag, because your suffering disturbed the others. And you couldn't be cured, but you could be quieted. In some cases, they tried to help. They'd bleed you, open a vein and let you drain, hoping that your weakness was the poison leaving your body. Or they'd force you to swallow mixtures of ash, herbs, or worse, boiled mold, powdered bone, even mercury if someone really hated you. The remedies often did more harm than the illness, but you drank them, because dying in agony felt slower. Some prisons had surgeons, barber surgeons to be precise, Men with blades who cut hair 1 minute and amputated gangrenous limbs the next, with no anesthesia, no sanitation, no training beyond cut fast, hope for the best. Screaming was normal. Passing out was a blessing. And what about your cellmates? They didn't help, couldn't. If they got too close, they caught it. If they didn't, they felt guilty. So, mostly, they watched you. From the other side of the cell, whispering their last words for you, or pretending they didn't see you slowly fall apart. There was no recovery here, no hospital wing, no miracle cure. When your body broke, it stayed broken. When your mind cracked, it stayed cracked. And when your time came, you died where you lay, in filth, in pain, in silence. And then you were dragged out, tossed in a pit, forgotten. If you've made it this far, starving, feverish, barely conscious, then congratulations. Your reward, nature calls. And there's no way to politely say this. Medieval prison hygiene didn't exist. There were no bathrooms, no chamber pots, no drainage systems, just corners, just filth, just shame. When the need came, you did what everyone did. You picked a wall, a dark spot, anywhere out of the direct path of traffic, or not. The stench was already unbearable. Adding to it was just another drop in the bucket. Sometimes, quite literally. In rare cases, dungeons had a designated waste bucket, but it was never emptied, not regularly, not effectively. If it spilled, it stayed. If it overflowed, the waste mingled with the straw, the water, the food. You relieved yourself beside your cellmates, while they slept, while they ate, while they begged not to be splashed. There was no privacy. You crouched in the dark, listening to the shuffle of rats, the whisper of others doing the same. You didn't make eye contact, didn't speak, just tried to finish before your own nausea got the better of you. And if you were shackled, or too weak to stand, you went where you were, right under yourself, lying in it, sleeping in it, soaking your wounds in it. Infection was a matter of time, not possibility. Diarrhea was normal, so were sores, so were maggots. Feces stuck to your skin, crusted in your hair, burned in your eyes. The smell was apocalyptic, a mix of human waste, rot, old food, bile, and blood. Some said it stuck in your nose even after release, if you lived long enough to be released. Guards didn't clean, they didn't supply anything, they didn't care. If you complained, they laughed. If you vomited, they added it to the soup. Washing your hands, dream on. There was no soap, no water, no time. You wiped with straw, with rags, with nothing. Then touched your food, your mouth, your wounds, and the diseases did the rest. Some prisoners lost the will to care. They smeared their own filth on the walls, on themselves as protest or madness. Others wept while crouching, humiliated, shaking, their dignity shredded like the rags they wore. Others just stopped going entirely, their bodies shutting down, swelling with poison until they burst inside. And through it all, no one blinked. No one gasped. No one asked how it came to this, because it was normal, accepted, expected. You weren't human anymore. You were a part of the dungeon, and the dungeon smelled like despair. So yes, when it was time to go, you didn't raise your hand. You didn't ask. You just picked a corner and hoped it wasn't someone's face. Now, let's say the guards drag you out of your pit. Not to feed you, not to clean you, but to question you. Interrogation, they call it. But you quickly realize this isn't about asking questions. It's about making answers. And it's not justice, it's theater. Blood-soaked, bone-cracking theater performed for an audience of tormentors who already know how the show ends. There was no presumption of innocence, no evidence to disprove, no logic to unravel. The moment you were accused, your fate was sealed. Interrogation was just the formality that let them hurt you legally. They asked questions only to hear your screams. They wanted a confession, not a true one, just any confession. Yours, someone else's. It didn't matter. Words under pain were their favorite script. The room wasn't a courtroom, it was a stage. Torchlight flickered on wet stone. Chains rattled with every shiver. Hooks dangled like props. Tools were laid out like a butcher's banquet. Iron pincers, branding rods, the rack. The chair with spikes. The boot that crushed. The pear that tore. Instruments of persuasion, they called them. You were brought in shackled, half-starved, maybe already bleeding, and the performance began. First, questions. Calm, measured, smiling. Do you admit to consorting with heretics? You say no. That's Act 1. Then the pain starts. A turn of the thumbscrews, a tightening of the ropes. Your joints stretch. Populations snap. You cry out. You beg. They nod, as if confirming your guilt. A guilty man screams, they say. An innocent man screams louder. There is no winning. They hoist you, drop you, smash your legs, split your skin, burn your feet, cut your scalp. They laugh, take notes, insult your screams. The cruelty isn't rushed, it's orchestrated. Every scream is timed. Every plea is measured. They break you not just physically, but publicly. As a lesson, a warning, a spectacle. And the worst part? They might pause, wipe the sweat from your face, offer water, not mercy, hope, false hope. So when you speak, when you say what they want, you think, maybe they'll stop, but they don't. Not until the performance is over. Until your confession includes everything. Sins you never imagined, conspiracies you couldn't spell, names of people you barely knew. And when you're finished, you're dragged back to your cell like a broken prop, bloodied, shaking, brain spinning. And if you don't die that night, you dream of doing so, because at least then the show would be over. But for them, there's always a next act. Another prisoner, another performance, another confession crafted not from truth, but from agony. Torture in the Middle Ages wasn't improvised. It wasn't chaotic. It was curated, designed, crafted with the same care you'd use for a sculpture. Except the only thing being carved was the human body. And in the hands of the interrogators, you weren't a person. You were a project, a challenge, a lump of flesh waiting to be reshaped by agony. They didn't hide the tools, they displayed them. Proudly, the wheel, the rack, the iron boot, each one with a history, a purpose, a poetry of pain perfected over generations. Let's start with the rack. You were tied at your wrists and ankles to rollers at opposite ends of a wooden frame. Then they began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Your limbs pulled tight, tighter still, until joints popped like snapping branches. Ligaments tore, muscles stretched past their limits. Eventually, bones cracked, shoulders unseated, hips dislocated, spinal cords bent like twine. Every inch of you screamed, and still, they turned, asking you questions you couldn't answer even if you tried, because all you could think about was the sound of your body coming undone. Then there was the breaking wheel, a favorite for executions, but just as effective for extracting confessions. You were tied to a wooden wheel, limbs extended over the spokes. Then came the club, the hammer, the iron bar, each bone shattered methodically. Arms, legs, ribs, one after the other. Not enough to kill, not yet. Just enough to make death feel like a promotion. The iron boot was more subtle. Your foot slid into a metal casing lined with spikes or crushed with wedges. Then, one by one, they drove wooden blocks between the casing and your skin. The pressure increased slowly, until skin split, until bones shattered into splinters, until your own screams deafened you. And these were just the greatest hits. There were thumb screws, tongue tearers, the knee crusher, the head vise, hooks for flaying, pliers for flesh, iron collars, iron gags, iron everything, heated, twisted, applied with skill. Torturers were professionals, trained artisans of suffering. They studied anatomy not to heal, but to harm more efficiently. The purpose was never justice, it was dominance, fear, submission. You weren't a criminal, you were a lesson, a warning, a demonstration of what power looked like in its rawest, cruelest form. You could confess on the first turn, you could scream names, beg, it didn't matter, the machine kept turning. And if you lived through it, you didn't walk away, you crawled, or were carried, or simply never moved again. This wasn't punishment, this was a performance, a cathedral of agony where your body was the sermon and the screams were the hymns. If you stayed in a medieval dungeon long enough, there was one sound that became as familiar as your heartbeat. Screaming. Not shouting, not moaning, screaming. Raw, animal, wordless pain that filled the air like incense in a poisoned church. It echoed off the stone walls, seeping into your ears, your spine, your dreams, until you didn't hear it anymore, not because it stopped, but because it became part of the silence. Screaming meant someone was alive, still fighting, still resisting. It was the last sound a soul made before it broke. Sometimes it came in bursts, short, sharp cries that ended suddenly, either because the torture paused or because the prisoner passed out. Other times it was constant, endless, wailing that rose and fell like the wind through a broken cathedral. You'd hear it in the middle of the night, midday, at random intervals, and you never knew who it was, a friend, a stranger, yourself in a few hours. That uncertainty ate at you, because every scream you heard was a countdown, a warning, a prophecy. Some screamed for hours. Others had it beaten out of them in minutes. There were prisoners who didn't scream at all, not because they were brave, but because their throats had been crushed, or their tongues removed, or their minds shattered. Silence wasn't bravery. It was horror. And the guards? They didn't flinch, didn't pause. They were numb, trained, or worse, amused. Some joked about the noise, compared notes on pitch, mocked the ones who begged for mercy, laughed when it went on too long. Because in the dungeon, empathy wasn't just missing, it was forbidden. You were expected to watch, listen, endure. New prisoners always asked, "What's that sound?" Veterans just stared at the wall, because they knew, and because soon the question would answer itself. Screaming was the dungeon's language, its pulse, its heartbeat, and eventually it got inside you. You'd wake up gasping, hearing it in your dreams. Or worse, you'd wake up screaming, not knowing what your mind had just remembered, not knowing what you'd felt, or what was coming next. Because in a place where the light never changes, and the air never shifts, and the food never satisfies, screaming was the only sign that something was still alive. And when it finally stopped, that was when you knew the worst part had just begun. Chains in a medieval prison weren't just restraints, they were part of the architecture. Like the stone walls and dripping ceilings, they were everywhere, hanging from hooks, bolted to floors, wrapped around necks, clamped on ankles. They were your new wardrobe, your new identity, your new reality. You didn't get to choose your fit. The guards decided whether you got shackles, cuffs, or a full iron collar. sometimes all three. It wasn't about escape prevention. Most prisoners couldn't even walk straight, let alone run. The chains were symbolic, psychological. They said, "You are ours. You belong to the dungeon now." Some chains were long enough to let you shuffle across the cell, dragging metal across stone like a dying song. Others were so tight you couldn't stand. You sat, you lay, you twisted yourself into strange contortions just to relieve the pressure. And if you complained, they tightened them. Rusted metal cut through skin like a knife through wet paper. You bled, you bruised, and infections followed like loyal dogs. There were prisoners who had worn their chains so long their skin had grown around them, flesh fusing with iron, a grotesque partnership that couldn't be undone without tearing them apart. Others developed sores, ulcers, or gangrene where the cuffs rubbed constantly against bone. Sleep? Forget it. Try drifting off with 10 pounds of iron wrapped around your neck. Try shifting positions when your ankles are bolted to the floor. Try not screaming when you roll over and the cuff digs into the raw wound on your wrist. Some prisoners learned to sleep sitting up. Others gave up trying. And they weren't clean either. Chains were passed from one prisoner to the next without washing. Blood, pus, sweat, disease, everything the last man carried, you now wore. There were cases where prisoners caught tetanus, sepsis, or plague from the shackles themselves. Then there was the noise. Every movement echoed, every breath was a rattle. You didn't just live in chains, you sounded like chains. Other prisoners heard you coming. Guards knew where you were. Silence became impossible, and eventually you internalized it. The clink of metal became your pulse, your heartbeat, your identity. They didn't remove the chains. Not unless you died, and sometimes not even then. So no, chains weren't restraints. They were a declaration, a sentence. A slow, cold whisper that followed you every hour of every day. You will never be free again. The dungeon's scent hit you like a hammer the moment the door closed behind you, and it never left. You could get used to the dark, maybe. You could adjust to the pain. But the smell was its own kind of torture. A living, breathing presence that clawed into your nostrils and refused to let go. It was beyond foul, beyond rotation. It was layered. The bass note was human waste. Days, weeks, months of it. Smeared into stone, soaked into straw, stewing in corners where buckets had tipped or never existed. On top of that, you had sweat. Not fresh sweat, but old, fermented sweat baked into clothes that hadn't been washed in months, mingled with fear and fever and grease. Then came the blood, sharp, metallic, always fresh from someone. It painted the floors. It crusted on chains. It dripped from bedsore-covered bodies. Next, the rot, flesh rot, teeth rot, gum rot, the sour, sickly stench of decay creeping out of wounds and mouths that had never seen a toothbrush or clean bandage. Sometimes it mixed with vomit. Hot, acidic, sickly sweet from spoiled food or disease-induced retching. And if that wasn't enough, add in the smoke. From torches, from burning hair, from scorched skin when interrogations got creative. It clung to the air like a curse. Some parts of the prison smelled like a slaughterhouse, others like an open grave. Every step brought a new horror to your nose, and it never left. It got into your skin, your hair, your clothes, into your memory. Prisoners who were released said they could still smell it years later, in their homes, in their dreams, even in open fields where the air was supposed to be clean. It haunted them, possessed them, broke them in a way the chains never could. You couldn't block it out. There were no windows to open, no soap to scrub with, no cloth to cover your nose that wasn't already drenched in the smell itself. You'd try breathing through your mouth, only to taste it. That was worse. Guards joked about it. Visitors gagged, some fainted. Priests refused to enter for last rites, blessing from the doorway like they were casting spells into hell. And that's exactly what it felt like. Hell. Not fire, not demons. Just this choking, unholy aroma of concentrated despair. In the end, the smell wasn't just a symptom. It was a statement. It said, there is no dignity here, no cleanliness, no care, no hope, just layers of human suffering baked into stone. It wasn't just a smell, it was a warning, and by the time you understood it, it was already inside you. In medieval prisons, solitude was a lie. Even if you were thrown into a cell by yourself, no screaming cellmates, no wheezing bodies in the dark, you were never truly alone. Because something always came crawling. Something always had its teeth or stingers or legs just out of sight, just under your skin, just waiting. Insects were the true jailers of the dungeon. They lived there before you. They fed on those before you. And now you were next, fleas first. They didn't wait long. They lived in the straw, the rags, the seams of your tunic, if you had one. You didn't feel the first bite, but by the time you did, it was too late. Your skin erupted in red. You scratched, you bled, you scratched more. They bit again and again. Some prisoners tore themselves open, not out of madness, but out of desperation. Fleas didn't leave, they multiplied, then lice. Head, body, public. They had no mercy, no shame. They crawled along your scalp, burrowed into your seams, clung to your eyebrows like decorations. You felt them, even when you didn't see them, that phantom itch that never stopped, the constant scratching, the raw, bleeding scalp. They laid eggs in your clothes, hatched while you slept. And every morning they greeted you like old friends. Worms came next. In your food, in your sores, in your stool. They bred in the filth you lived in. Hookworms sucked your blood from the inside. Tapeworms stole your food. Maggots squirmed in wounds you didn't know you had until you smelled them. Some prisoners found them between their toes, under their tongues, or in open cuts. Some pulled them out with trembling fingers, only for more to return. Spiders, roaches, mites, flies that laid eggs in anything wet and still, including you, including your mouth if you slept too deeply. You tried to swat them, at first, but that wasted energy. So eventually, you learned to let them crawl. Over your feet, across your lips, into your ears, and the worst part? You stopped being disgusted. The first night you gagged, the second you whimpered, but by the third week you let the bugs crawl. Because they weren't enemies anymore. They were company, they were survivors, just like you. In this place, they didn't come and go. They stayed. They lived on you, in you. You weren't alone. You were a hotel, a nest, a breeding ground for all that squirmed and bit and laid eggs. So, no, you didn't fear the other prisoners. You feared the things that fed on all of you equally. The crawling reminders that no matter how low you thought you were, there was always something lower. And it had 1,000 legs. You've been arrested, accused, beaten, chained, maybe even tortured. But now you wait. For what? You're not sure. A trial? A verdict? Someone to tell you what happens next? Don't hold your breath. Because in a medieval dungeon, waiting was the sentence. You didn't count down to a court date. You counted lice, rat bites, and how many screams you heard before breakfast. Justice wasn't a system. It was a superstition. Trials were rare. Even when they happened, they didn't happen fast. Or fairly. You could wait days, weeks, months, years. There were prisoners who died before ever hearing what they were charged with. Others were simply forgotten, buried in the paperwork, the politics, or the dust of centuries. There was no bail system, no attorneys checking in, no advocates pushing your case forward. Once inside, the outside world stopped existing. Unless someone powerful took an interest in you, which usually meant you were valuable or entertaining. You were invisible. Not imprisoned, erased. Guards didn't tell you the time. There were no clocks, no candles counted down. The only time you heard the word tomorrow was when they delayed your torture again. Or your execution. Or the thing they never defined, just hinted at with a smile. Soon, they said. You'll find out soon. And you believed them. At first. Then days turned to weeks, and hope rotted like the bread they threw into your cell. Your mind unraveled. You replayed every conversation. Every memory. What did I say wrong? What did I do? Who saw me? Who betrayed me? You begged to see a judge, they laughed. You offered names. They shrugged. You asked for confession. They said you already gave it. You hadn't. But that didn't matter. Eventually, you stopped asking. You became like the others. Staring at the wall, rocking slowly, whispering things only the shadows understood. You weren't waiting for justice anymore. You were waiting for anything. A noise, a boot step, even a scream. Something to break the silence of not knowing. And the cruelest trick. Sometimes you did get a trial, after months or years, after you'd forgotten how to speak properly, after you'd confessed to everything and everyone. And the trial was a farce, a ceremony, a formality, a rubber stamp that said, yes, your suffering was justified. But it never felt like justice. It felt like mockery. Because the real punishment wasn't the verdict, it was the waiting, the silence, the sense that no one cared if you lived or died or simply dissolved into bones and whispers in a hole in the ground. No court date meant no timeline, no closure, just time, eternal, endless time, pressing down like a second set of chains. And the longer you waited, the more you wondered, maybe this is the punishment. Maybe this is the point. In medieval prisons, justice didn't come from the law. It came from your coin purse. The guards didn't care about innocence. The judges didn't care about evidence, but everyone cared about gold or silver, or anything you could trade for mercy. Because in this world, bribery wasn't corruption. It was standard procedure. If you had money, your cell looked different. Maybe not clean, maybe not warm, but better. A bit of straw that hadn't been urinated on, an extra crust of bread that hadn't been gnawed by rats. Water that wasn't green. A candle. One flickering light in the ocean of blackness. And if you were really wealthy, you could buy space, privacy, clean bandages, even a real bed, a wooden frame, a blanket. Luxury beyond imagining for everyone else. But bribes didn't stop at comfort. They bought you silence. Guards who looked the other way, who lost your name on the torture list, who let your visitors through with notes, food, medicine, maybe even a file and a loaf of bread. Yes, that cliché had a price tag. Everything did. You could even bribe your way out. Freedom wasn't granted. It was purchased. If your family had influence, or if someone owed them a favor, you might disappear from the ledger overnight. One day, you're chained. The next, you're walking out, sun in your eyes, the others staring after you with a mix of awe and bitterness. But for the poor, the accused with nothing, you could scream, bleed, beg. No one listened. No one helped. No extra rations, no safer cell. No delay in your torture, and certainly no pardon. You were meat, waiting for rot. And when the rich walked out, the poor filled the space they left behind. Even inside the dungeon, a black market thrived. A stolen ring traded for an extra bowl of pottage. A favor owed for a dry spot to sleep. Smuggling routes run through the guards themselves. They took cuts, took bribes, took prisoners apart for not paying on time, And if someone saw you bribe, that didn't bring punishment. It brought competition. Others tried to outbid you, to undercut you. You weren't trying to prove innocence. You were fighting for survival on the open market. And every coin tossed changed a life. So, yes, the dungeon had laws, but none were written, and all could be bought. Justice didn't wear a blindfold. She wore a money pouch. And when you whispered your last prayer in the dark, it wasn't to a god, it was to gold. If you think the prisoners were the worst part of medieval incarceration, think again. The inmates were broken, beaten, desperate, but the guards were chosen for cruelty, promoted for indifference, rewarded for creative sadism. They weren't there to maintain order. They were there to enforce chaos, to enjoy it. These weren't noble watchmen. They weren't trained protectors of justice. They were butchers with badges, farmers who lost their land, ex-soldiers who missed the killing, thugs who learned how to follow orders just enough to get paid. And the job description was simple. Control the animals, by any means. They beat you for noise, beat you for silence, beat you for fun. And when they didn't beat you, they invented games. Throwing scraps into cells and watching prisoners fight. Lighting straw on fire and laughing as you scrambled to stomp it out with chained feet. Locking you in pitch black for days. Or pouring freezing water over you at midnight. Because why not? They stole what little you had. If your family sent food, they ate it. If someone smuggled in medicine, they sold it. And if you protested, more beatings, fewer meals, colder nights. Some guards made deals, give them names, false or real, and they'd spare you. Refuse, and you became the next screaming echo in the hallway. Sexual violence? It happened. To women, to men, to children. Guards who controlled every second of your life also controlled your body. And no one stopped them. No one cared. It was just another part of the punishment. Unspoken, but expected. Some guards wore their cruelty like armor, stoic, emotionless. Others smiled, whistled, told jokes while you screamed. Those were worse. Because they didn't hate you, they simply didn't see you. You were not a person. You were entertainment, noise, something to pass the shift. And worst of all, sometimes they showed kindness, just enough to confuse you. A warm drink, a dry cloth, a kind word whispered after a whipping. And for a moment you felt hope. But that was part of the game, to break you, to show you the leash, then yank it away. So when you curled up at night, cold and hungry, it wasn't the rats you feared, it wasn't the disease, it wasn't even the darkness, it was the footsteps, the jangle of keys, the low, laughing voice outside the door, because the worst monsters in the dungeon didn't wear chains. They carried them. If being a prisoner in the Middle Ages was a nightmare, then being a woman in prison was hell carved an extra level deeper. Every cruelty that men suffered, disease, hunger, filth, torture, women endured too. But on top of that came a second punishment, their gender. Women in medieval prisons weren't treated as prisoners. They were treated as property, defiled, dismissed, and destroyed without consequence. Their cells weren't separate. There were no women's wings, no considerations for dignity. They were thrown in with men, regardless of age or crime. Assault was expected, protection was non-existent. And the guards? Often the worst offenders. Some women were arrested for real crimes. Others were jailed for nothing more than gossip, disobedience, or the suspicion of being a witch, a whore, or simply loud. A woman who defied her husband. A widow with land. A midwife with knowledge. Any of them could find themselves dragged into the dungeon and chained like cattle. Once inside, a woman had no privacy. She bled on stone, gave birth in straw, was stripped during searches. There was no menstrual care, no compassion, just pain layered over shame, layered over fear. If she screamed for help, no one answered. If she resisted, they beat her harder. Rape wasn't just common, it was routine. Guards abused their power daily, forcing themselves on female prisoners with impunity. Other inmates joined in. A woman who tried to fight back was called a liar, a witch, or a madwoman, and punished accordingly. Many learned not to scream, learned to dissociate, learned to disappear inside their own minds. Pregnancy didn't protect them. It made things worse. If a woman was pregnant on arrival, she was accused of seduction or sin. If she became pregnant inside, no one asked how. They knew how, they just didn't care. Women also carried the burden of shame. Men in the dungeon were seen as criminals. Women as disgraced, broken, spoiled. If they somehow survived, they returned to a world that wanted nothing to do with them. Shunned, forgotten. They couldn't marry, couldn't work. Many returned to the streets or back into the dungeon again. And if they didn't survive, no one remembered them. No marker, no prayers, no records. Their names erased, their stories whispered, their bones buried in silence beneath centuries of stone. So yes, men suffered. But women were made to suffer differently. More intimately, more invisibly. Their pain folded into layers of control, abuse, and institutional cruelty that was never written in the law, but carved into every dungeon wall. Pregnancy in a medieval dungeon wasn't a blessing. It wasn't a condition. It was a sentence. If you were pregnant when you entered, you were already condemned to a deeper layer of suffering. And if you became pregnant while inside, that was its own horror story. There were no midwives in prison, no beds, no towels, no boiling water or herbal tea, just stone, straw, chains, and the slow, agonizing realization that your body was about to do something incredibly dangerous. With no help, no mercy, and nowhere to go but down. A pregnant prisoner was still shackled, still beaten, still deprived of food. Her hunger doubled. Her thirst grew unbearable. Her body bloated, ached, tore itself apart day by day, and the guards didn't care. They didn't reduce her work. They didn't offer better food. In fact, they blamed her for needing more. "You shouldn't have gotten pregnant," they said, while ignoring how or who made it happen. Labor came early, or late, or in silence, or in screams. Women gave birth in chains, on cold floors, surrounded by rats, sometimes alone, sometimes watched, sometimes laughed at. Babies were born into filth, sliding from bodies too weak to push, landing in straw too dirty to hold life. Some babies survived, most didn't. They choked, froze, starved, were crushed by accident, or taken away by guards, never to be seen again. Some were dumped in pits, others drowned in buckets. A few were raised in prison for as long as they could breathe, but no one called it living. For the mother, there was no recovery, no postpartum care, no rest, just more bleeding, more infection, more cold. You delivered your child, buried them in the corner of the cell, and returned to the same misery with a torn body and a hollow soul. And if a woman was sentenced to die, some asked for mercy, for the sake of the unborn. Some begged to delay execution until the baby could be born. Most were ignored. The rope didn't wait. The fire didn't care. Pregnant or not, you were hanged, burned, beheaded. The baby died inside you, alongside you, with no name, no chance. In stories, motherhood is sacred. In the dungeon, it was cursed. A cruel twist of fate that offered no joy, no protection. Just another way for the prison to remind you, your body is not yours, your pain is not special, and your child is not welcome. You might think children were spared the dungeon, that some moral line existed, some shred of mercy for the young. But the Middle Ages didn't deal in mercy. Children were not innocent in the eyes of the law. They were small criminals, tiny sinners, and prison didn't care about size. Children were imprisoned for theft, begging, blasphemy, for being orphans, vagrants, or simply unclaimed. Some were born in prison. Others arrived in chains, arrested alongside their parents. Some entered alone, nameless, scared, already hardened by the streets. And once inside, they weren't given smaller cells. They weren't separated from adults. A child shared space with murderers, rapists, the insane. They were thrown into corners like rags, no bed, no blanket, just a stone floor and the flicker of a torch they were told never to touch. Some were beaten daily, by guards or by older inmates. Some became servants, forced to clean waste, haul water, fetch food, if food existed. Others were exploited, abused, or traded for favors in the black market of the prison's underbelly. They starved, cried themselves hoarse, died of fevers. Rats bit their toes at night. Lice nested in their scalps. Some were too young to speak, too small to stand. And yet, there they were, chained to the wall next to grown men who no longer noticed them. No toys, no comfort, just darkness, just fear, just time that stretched forever. They learned quickly not to speak unless spoken to eat fast, to keep their heads down, and for the older ones, they grew into monsters or ghosts. There was no in-between. Some mothers in prison tried to protect their children, keeping them close, feeding them crumbs, covering their ears during screams. But the dungeon always won. It took the innocence first, then the spirit, then the body. There are records of children dying before their names were ever written down. Records of executions, floggings, tortures administered to boys barely old enough to carry a stick. One child was hanged at age 7. Another died during interrogation at 10. In a place built to break adults, children didn't stand a chance. They were raised in hell, lived as shadows, died without notice. And the worst part? They didn't ask, "When will I get out?" They asked, "Will I live until morning?" Prison is a place of isolation, but in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just about being locked away, it was about being forgotten. Once inside, the world stopped reaching for you. Friends vanished, family hid, letters never came, and visitors, they were rarer than sunlight. The truth is, most people didn't know where you were. You disappeared in the night. No public record, no announcements. You might be in the dungeon under the city, or in the basement of a fortress 3 days' ride away. And even if your loved ones did find you, gaining access was nearly impossible. Guards demanded bribes just to deliver a message, more to arrange a visit. And even then, there were risks. Visitors might be accused of conspiring, a whispered word taken as sedition, a tear interpreted as guilt. Many families simply stayed silent, too afraid to speak your name out loud. For most prisoners, no one came, not once, not ever. You stopped hoping, stopped waiting. You listened for footsteps, but they all belonged to guards. You imagined voices, but none called your name. Birthdays passed in darkness. Deaths happened without you knowing. Your village moved on, your home forgot. The silence became unbearable. You whispered to the walls, talked to rats, wrote invisible letters in the dirt. Some scratched names into the stone, last testaments to their own fading humanity. Anna was here. Forgive me, Jay. Mother, I'm still alive. And if someone did come, you weren't allowed to touch them. You spoke through bars, through cracks, watched them cry and couldn't wipe their tears, and the moment they left, the dungeon felt colder than ever. Hope didn't die all at once. It died one day at a time, one unanswered prayer, one ignored plea, one more meal alone, until finally you stopped imagining freedom. You stopped expecting justice. You stopped believing anyone outside even remembered you existed. In medieval prison, solitude wasn't a condition, it was a weapon. And once you realized you were truly alone, the dungeon didn't have to kill you. You were already gone. One of the last things people cling to when they're locked away is family. The idea that someone out there is fighting for you, missing you, trying to bring you home. But in a medieval prison, that hope faded fast, because family didn't come. And when they didn't come, a darker truth set in. Maybe they couldn't, or worse, maybe they wouldn't. Some families never knew where you were. The system didn't send notices. There were no records mailed home, no prison rosters posted in the village square. You vanished into a void, and the people who loved you were left with rumors, silence, or shame. Other families chose to forget. Prison carried a social stain worse than death. If your husband was jailed, your children might starve. If your daughter was arrested, your family name rotted alongside her. People distanced themselves for survival, out of fear, out of convenience. We don't speak of him anymore. She died, as far as we're concerned. Even loyal families were helpless. They couldn't afford bribes, couldn't find the right officials, couldn't challenge the church or nobility. And eventually, grief hardened into quiet acceptance. You became a memory scrubbed clean by time and necessity. And you waited. Every day, every whisper in the hall could be a voice you knew. Every footstep might be your father. Every clink of keys could mean someone came for you. But they never did. And eventually, you stopped hoping. Not because your love faded, but because holding on to it hurt too much. Some prisoners tried to send messages, scratched names into walls, etched initials into stone. "I'm still here," one wrote. "Don't forget me." But stone doesn't reply, and names written in dust disappear the moment someone breathes too hard. There were no reunions, no tearful embraces, just long nights in silence, birthdays that passed without a word, deaths you never heard about, children you never met, parents who died thinking you were guilty, or dead, or both. In a system built on silence, abandonment was inevitable. And by the time your name came up again, if it ever did, it was as part of a story told with a sigh. They were taken. They were lost. They were never seen again. And maybe, just maybe, someone would pause. Someone would feel the ache of your absence. But that moment would pass too, because the world moved on. And you? You stayed exactly where they left you. In the medieval dungeon, losing your mind wasn't unusual. It was expected. The system wasn't designed to preserve your sanity. It was built to strip it away, piece by piece, day by day, until all that remained was a shell who breathed but didn't live. There was no word for trauma, no understanding of depression, no concept of anxiety, psychosis, or post-traumatic stress. If you cried too much, you were weak. If you screamed too often, you were mad. If you stopped responding, you were possessed. And each of these labels carried punishments more brutal than the last. Madness wasn't treated. It was contained, or used. A prisoner who wept in his sleep might be mocked. One who talked to shadows might be beaten until they stopped, or killed because they wouldn't. Sometimes guards used the mentally ill for entertainment, unleashing them into other cells to spread panic. A screaming man was a warning. A woman rocking herself silently became a cautionary tale. The signs started small. Talking to yourself, hallucinations, panic attacks. But in a place where night never ended and pain never paused, those cracks grew fast. You forgot what month it was, then what year, then your name. Your voice sounded strange. Your hands didn't feel like yours. Reality lost meaning. Time unraveled. Some prisoners made up imaginary friends. Others told stories out loud to stay anchored. Some counted stones, scratched prayers, chewed their own fingers. Anything to remind themselves they still existed. And those who completely snapped, they became ghosts with flesh, wandering the cell, laughing at nothing, screaming at no one. Guards ignored them, or punished them for being loud. Other inmates gave them wide berth, afraid that madness might spread, like a cough or a curse. There were no therapists, no medics, no treatment. Madness was seen as divine punishment, the devil's work. And the only cure was silence or death. You didn't go to the dungeon to be reformed. You went there to disappear. And that included your mind, your memories, your sense of self, your ability to hope. In time, the dungeon didn't even need to torture you. It just waited, because the real executioner wasn't a blade or a rope. It was the day you stopped recognizing your own reflection in a puddle. In the medieval dungeon, there were only two ways out, through the door or through death, and for many, the door never opened. So they chose the only exit left. Suicide wasn't a tragedy in this place. It was routine. A decision made not in a moment of weakness, but after weeks, months, years of deliberate, crushing hopelessness. For some, it was the only act of control left. One final choice in a world that had stripped them of all others. And make no mistake, death didn't come easy here. If you wanted to die, you had to improvise. No ropes were handed out, no tools, just stone, rusted iron, and your own determination. Some strangled themselves with their shackles, twisting until breath gave out. Others bit open their wrists, tore out veins with their teeth. Some beat their heads against walls until skulls fractured. Others lay in filth, refusing food, water, movement, letting their body rot into stillness. The guards didn't stop it. Often they encouraged it. "Save us the trouble," they'd say. Sometimes they laughed as prisoners tried and failed. Sometimes they watched until the end, just to make sure the message stuck for everyone else. No one's coming. Other inmates rarely intervened. They were too far gone or too afraid. Some whispered prayers. Others turned their backs. A few held the dying and said nothing, because what could be said in a place where life had become the slowest form of execution? And when someone did die, the body stayed, until the smell forced removal, or until a new prisoner needed the space. No burial rites, no final words, just a dragged carcass and silence. But perhaps the worst part, the guilt, not for the dead, for the ones who stayed, who thought about doing the same, who looked at the same wall, the same chain, the same straw, and wondered, how did they do it? Because now that door was open, and it was always whispering. Some tried and failed, were revived, punished, mocked. "You think you get to choose?" the guards sneered. "You don't." Because even in death, prisoners weren't free. Even suicide was stolen from them. In the dungeon, dying by your own hand wasn't weakness. It was resistance. The last rebellion. The quiet scream that said, "You broke my body, but you will not own my end." For many prisoners in the Middle Ages, the dungeon wasn't the end, it was the waiting room. A place where you didn't just anticipate death, you marinated in it. Prisons weren't designed for long-term sentences. They weren't about rehabilitation. They were storage for the condemned. A place to rot until the rope was tied, the fire was lit, or the headsman sharpened his blade. You didn't count years. You counted how many others were taken before you. Your execution might have been scheduled. It might have been a secret. It might never have been mentioned at all. Sometimes you were told the date, and then it was changed again and again, so you suffered anew each time it passed. Sometimes you weren't told anything, and the door swung open without warning. "It's time," they'd say, and you'd go limp, not because you were calm, but because you'd been preparing to die for months. The methods varied: hanging, beheading, burning, drowning, some public, some private, some ceremonial, others done quietly in the dark, and all of them promised the same thing: finality, an end to the disease, the hunger, the cold, the chains. For some, it was almost a relief, and yet the waiting was the real punishment, because every sound could be your call. Every guard's bootstep might be it. You rehearsed your final words, dreamed of forgiveness, dreaded the moment your name would be shouted through the bars. Some prayed, some cursed. Some just sat in silence, staring at their own hands as if they could find answers in the filth under their nails. Worse still, you heard the executions. From down the hall, from the courtyard, the creak of the gallows, the roar of a crowd, the crack of fire, the scream that didn't end, and you counted. That's one more gone. That means I'm closer. Others went before you. You watched them change in the final hours. Some wept, some confessed, some became radiant, freeing themselves emotionally before the body followed. And then they were gone. Their corner of the cell empty, their echo still hanging in the air. The dungeon didn't kill you. Not directly. It just waited. Until someone else decided the day, the hour, the method. And when they came for you, they didn't say goodbye. No ceremony, no closure, just the door, just the rope, just the silence afterward. In the Middle Ages, death wasn't just a sentence, it was a spectacle. Executions weren't carried out in silence or behind closed doors. They were held in the square, on platforms, at crossroads. The stage was set. The crowd gathered. And you? You were the main event. It started with the announcement, the bell, the proclamation. People left work, brought their children. Merchants set up stalls. It wasn't a day of mourning, it was entertainment. A parade of pain with front-row seats for all. You were dragged out of the dungeon half dead, shackled, limping, starving. If you resisted, they beat you until you couldn't. If you screamed, they gagged you. If you cried, they cheered louder. Your body was broken before you even reached the scaffold. There were many ways to die. Hanging was common, slow, strangling, with the crowd watching your legs twitch. Beheading was faster but not guaranteed. A dull blade meant multiple strikes. The crowd counted them like game points. Burning was saved for witches and heretics. Tied to the stake, flames licking your skin, smoke pouring from your mouth before your screams stopped. Sometimes you were made to confess. Stand tall, apologize, beg, and when you did, they called you coward. If you stayed silent, they called you defiant. Either way, the crowd got what it came for. Executions weren't just punishment, they were ritual. They cleansed the city, reaffirmed the power of the state, the church, the nobility. You were proof of what happened when people broke the rules, when they questioned, resisted, stole, spoke, loved the wrong person, believed the wrong thing. And the children watched, learned, clapped along. Because this wasn't just about justice, it was about training the next generation to obey. And when it was over, your body was left hanging, rotting, a warning. Birds pecked your eyes. Dogs sniffed your feet. You were part of the landscape now. A permanent, decomposing reminder of who held power and who didn't. Your name might be remembered, but not with reverence. You'd be a footnote. A cautionary tale. The last act in a play written by others, performed in front of a crowd that never knew you, but still applauded when you died. Not every punishment ended in death. Some were slower, more public, more humiliating, and none were as iconic or as degrading as the stocks. They stood in the middle of town, a wooden frame with holes for your head, your hands, and sometimes your feet. You were locked in, bent over, exposed like an exhibit in the Museum of Shame. You couldn't move, couldn't speak freely, could barely breathe without tasting dirt and spit. And the people came. Not to pity you, not to question why you were there, but to participate. Humiliation was a group activity, a civic event, a pastime. They threw things, mud, manure, rotten vegetables, dead animals, whatever hurt or stank or both. Some urinated on you, others just laughed, mocked your face, mocked your crime, called your mother names, jeered when you flinched, cheered when you cried. Children poked you with sticks. Women hurled insults like knives. Old men gave advice between spits. There were no guards to stop it. In fact, they encouraged it, kept the crowd lively, sometimes even joined in. And your crime? Maybe you stole bread, or spoke back to a priest, or missed church. Maybe you were just unlucky. Someone needed an example and you were convenient. You stayed in the stocks for hours, or days, until your back locked up, until your skin blistered, until your dignity disintegrated. If it rained, you drowned in filth. If it was sunny, your skin cracked. You could faint, starve, go mad, no one cared. You were part of the scenery now. And when they finally let you go, the shame stayed. You walked home sticky with rot, covered in bruises, laughed at by neighbors, avoided by employers. You were marked, not just by the law, but by society. Because the stocks weren't about justice, they were about humiliation, a public branding, a reminder that the town watched and the town judged and the town enjoyed every second of your suffering. It wasn't punishment, it was a performance. And you were just another actor who never got paid. When the Middle Ages wanted to make sure you never forgot what you did, or what they said you did, they didn't give you a fine or a warning. They gave you a scar. Branding wasn't punishment. It was identity reassignment. One red-hot iron pressed against your skin, and you carried your sentence until the day you died. The mark varied by crime. A T for thief, a B for blasphemer, an H for heretic. Letters, symbols, crests, each one a public announcement. This one has sinned. And it wasn't subtle. They didn't brand the bottom of your foot. It was your face, your hand, your shoulder. Places no cloak could cover, no lie could hide. The process was simple, brutal. You were tied down, sometimes standing, sometimes strapped to a bench. The iron sat in the coals until it glowed like a demon's eye. The executioner didn't hesitate. He pressed it to your flesh with practiced efficiency. The sound wasn't a scream. It was sizzle. Then came the stench, cooked skin, burned hair, scorched guilt. You didn't pass out, not if they did it right. Pain kept you conscious. Shame kept you quiet. And when they were done, they held up a mirror, if they were generous. Or let the crowd see first, if they weren't. Some people fainted at the sight. Others wept. But most just stared in shock, as if trying to unsee what was now forever part of them. There was no healing, no clean bandages, no ointment. You wrapped the wound in rags, if they gave you any, and hoped it didn't get infected. Most did. The scar puffed, bled, crusted, then twisted into a permanent red emblem of disgrace. Some healed with jagged ridges, others blistered. A few prisoners tried to remove the brand, cutting the flesh out with sharp stones, burning over it again. It didn't help, it only made the mark worse. Outside the prison, the branding followed you, employers refused you, churches turned you away, people crossed the street when you passed. Children stared, women whispered. You weren't a person anymore, you were a warning, and if you committed another crime, they branded the other cheek, the other arm, or just layered a second brand over the first, until your body looked like a walking alphabet of regret. The law didn't stop at pain, it needed permanence, and branding was the perfect blend of cruelty and memory, a mark that said, "This is who you are now, forever." Not every prisoner was meant to die. Some were valuable, not because of innocence, not because of mercy, but because they were worth something. Gold, land, leverage. In the twisted economy of medieval justice, a prisoner wasn't just a criminal, they were a commodity. This was especially true for the wealthy, the connected, or the strategically useful. You were arrested, yes, tortured, definitely, but not to kill you. Just enough to scare you. Just enough to make the price go up. Your family got the letter. "We have your son. He is alive, for now." And the ransom began. Negotiated by scribes, carried by messengers, paid in coin, grain, jewels, or territory. Sometimes demands were fair. Sometimes they were impossible. But always the suffering came first. Because a broken prisoner was more persuasive than a defiant one. So they tortured you, not to confess, but to bleed value, bruised, starved, teeth missing, fingers broken. That way, when the letter arrived, it came with a description. He has one eye now. The next payment decides if he keeps the other. Sometimes the family paid, the prisoner was released. He walked free, scarred, shattered, but breathing. Other times they didn't or couldn't, and the torture escalated, or the prisoner disappeared. Nobles used ransom as politics. Kings did it to trade. Captains took hostages in war. Priests even sold accused heretics to foreign buyers. Everyone got paid, guards, scribes, torturers. Even if the prisoner died, someone profited. And prisoners knew it. They played the game, pleaded for life not from the courts but from their family's wallet. Some lied, claimed they were heirs, bastards of noble blood. Anything to increase their price tag. Because a cheap prisoner was a dead prisoner, and a rich one had leverage. Ransom didn't end suffering. It extended it. A slow negotiation of agony, a dance of letters, gold, and screams. And when it worked, it wasn't mercy, it was business, a transaction. In medieval prison, pain had currency, and if you were lucky enough to be valuable, you bled slowly. Not all prisons were hidden under city streets or buried in the outskirts of towns. Some were much closer to power, nestled right beneath it, because many medieval castles had dungeons built directly into their stone hearts. Behind the banners, beneath the banquet halls, under the feet of kings and queens, nobles and knights, suffering festered. These weren't dusty, forgotten pits. They were deliberate features, designed from the ground up, often as part of the original fortress plans. A castle wasn't complete without a place to silence enemies. And what better way to keep control than to imprison someone beneath your throne? The cells were worse than municipal jails. Cramped, damp, lightless, often no bigger than a closet, with ceilings low enough to break your spine if you stood too long. Some were oubliettes, literally forgotten places. You were lowered through a trapdoor, dropped into a vertical shaft with no door, no ladder, no escape. A pit of stone, you'd sit, lieutenant, die, unseen and unheard. And above, life continued, feasts, laughter, the clink of goblets, the scrape of noble boots pacing on floors built directly over your head. They could hear you scream and ignored it. That was the point. Your pain was entertainment, or, at best, white noise. These castle prisons held enemies of the crown, political prisoners, spies, traitors, nobles who lost a war or backed the wrong claimant to the throne. The closer your cell was to royalty, the more personal your punishment was. Torture chambers were often adjacent. Interrogations happened one room over from the chapel, and if you listened closely, you could hear the organ music rise and fall while someone was whipped just down the corridor. Guards were hand-picked, loyal to the lord of the castle, often crueler than professional jailers because they didn't answer to anyone but the noble above. You were at their mercy, and mercy was in short supply. These dungeons weren't meant to house common thieves. They were meant to make examples, to contain those whose bloodlines were too dangerous to spill openly. So instead, they were starved, forgotten, slowly erased beneath the very walls they once helped build or defend. There were prisoners who spent decades in castle cells, others who died nameless, bones found centuries later during renovations, some walled up entirely, sealed behind brick and forgotten forever. Castles were built to defend against invasion, but for the unlucky few imprisoned within, there was no need for a siege. Their fall happened stone by stone in silence. The medieval church preached mercy, forgiveness, divine love. But behind monastery doors and beneath cathedrals, another truth waited. Some of the most feared and brutal prisons in Europe were run not by kings, but by clergy. Ecclesiastical prisons were established to punish heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, and rebellion. But unlike state jails, these weren't about law, they were about belief. Your crime wasn't stealing bread. It was doubting doctrine, questioning priests, reading the Bible in the wrong language. The Inquisition, in particular, weaponized imprisonment. Suspects were dragged from homes in the night, confined in monastic cells so dark and narrow they felt more like tombs. You weren't allowed a lawyer. Often, you weren't even told your charges. The church said God would reveal the truth. But the revelation usually came after weeks of starvation, solitary confinement, and torture so holy it came with prayers. These prisons were quiet, cold, sterile, not filled with the noise of ordinary criminals, but the silent, trembling breath of intellectuals, mystics, scholars, people who thought too much, spoke too clearly, women who knew herbs, men who questioned saints, teenagers who asked the wrong questions during Mass. Interrogators wore robes, crosses, spoke in Latin. They smiled as they broke you, and when they were done, they led you to confession. Because if your soul didn't belong to the church, it belonged to the flames. Punishment wasn't always death. Sometimes it was silence, permanent silence. Prisoners were buried alive behind church walls, muzzled, shackled in isolation for years. No contact, no voices, no sound but dripping water and your own whispering madness. There were cells built so low you had to kneel for days. Others had crosses etched into every surface, a constant reminder that God was watching while you decayed. Food was holy, moldy bread, bitter wine. The body and blood, they said, poisoned with punishment. And the worst part? Many prisoners believed they were guilty, that their punishment was deserved. That pain was proof of divine judgment. They begged for forgiveness as they were flayed, recited psalms as they burned. The church didn't need swords, it had shame, didn't need ropes, it had doctrine, didn't need chains, it had confession. And those who survived left the dungeon not just physically broken, but spiritually dismantled. Because when God is your jailer, and salvation is used as a weapon, there is no escape, only obedience or ashes. Some prisoners were sentenced by law, others by silence. No trial, no execution, just disappearance. One day you were there, and the next the world moved on without you. In the Middle Ages, it didn't take much to vanish. A whisper, a rumor, a wrong look, and suddenly you no longer existed. Except in the cold, damp corners of a prison cell no one ever visited again. These were the forgotten. People erased by design, hidden so well that even time lost track of them. Their names weren't written. Their charges weren't recorded. Their cells weren't marked. They were political inconveniences, religious threats, personal embarrassments, secrets buried beneath stone. Some were locked in oubliettes. Narrow shafts meant not for confinement but oblivion. No doors, just a hole. You were lowered in or dropped and never pulled out again. Food, maybe, at first. Water, rarely. Then nothing. Just darkness, echoing prayers, and death so slow it stopped feeling real. Others were placed behind false walls, sealed in hidden chambers, trapped behind bricks meant to last forever. They died standing, kneeling, clawing, screaming, only at first, then whispering, then waiting, until the silence consumed them too. No one asked about them, no one remembered. The guards changed, the paperwork vanished, the building was rebuilt, the grave never dug. Even their bodies, if found, were anonymous bundles of bone in places no one should have been. These weren't executions. They were erasures, a punishment so complete it didn't need a blade or fire, just time and silence and stone. And maybe the worst part? The world kept spinning. Empires rose and fell above the heads of the forgotten. Festivals rang out while they decayed. The very church bells that tolled over their homeland never knew who was buried beneath the floor. We like to believe every life leaves a trace, that someone notices when we're gone. But in the medieval dungeon, some prisoners weren't just punished, they were deleted. Escape. The word echoed through every medieval cell, a fantasy, a prayer, a heartbeat of defiance and a place designed to erase it. But the truth, escaping a dungeon was almost impossible. 1 in 1,000. And even then, it didn't mean freedom. Just a different kind of dying. These weren't prisons with clever blueprints and hidden tunnels. They were fortresses, mausoleums, deep, layered pits beneath castles and cities, built by masons who understood that fear starts with stone. Walls so thick your screams bounced back at you. Gates sealed with iron, locks the size of bricks. You were chained, starved, sick. You couldn't run, couldn't climb, could barely stand. And the guards weren't fools. They watched, counted, knew every whisper and shadow. Escape meant bribery, seduction, teamwork, luck, and a kind of madness that turned desperation into genius. Some prisoners tried anyway, dug with bones, picked locks with splinters, hid beneath corpses during disposal. Others bribed a guard with their last ring, or begged a sympathetic monk to leave a door unlatched. Some disguised themselves as corpses. Others smeared themselves with filth and crawled through waste channels into the freezing dark. The few who did escape, most were caught. Hunted down by dogs, knights, bounty hunters, hauled back for punishment worse than death, public beatings, brandings. eyes gouged out as a reminder to others. You don't leave the dungeon, you die in it. But 1 in 1,000 made it, slipped into the woods, disappeared into a crowd, took a new name, lived in fear for the rest of their life, never feeling free, never sleeping deeply, always waiting for the hand on the shoulder, the door creaking open. Because even if you escaped the dungeon never let go. Surviving a medieval dungeon was a miracle. Escaping was rarer still. But even rarer being released, to walk out through the gates not in chains, not to die, but to live again. Or at least, that's what they called it. Freedom. But freedom didn't feel like sunlight and open fields. It felt like confusion, emptiness, guilt. Like returning from the dead only to realize the world moved on without you. Most released prisoners weren't pardoned. They were forgotten, traded, paid for, or finally deemed not worth the cost of feeding. You didn't walk out with dignity. You stumbled, limped, crawled, barefoot, half naked, your body a map of scars, your mind a landscape of screams. Outside, people didn't cheer. They stared, whispers followed you. You were a ghost, a rumor made of flesh. Some crossed themselves, others crossed the street. Employers wouldn't hire you, landowners wouldn't lease to you, families hesitated to embrace you. What did you do? They asked. You didn't know anymore. And the body didn't forget. Your back ached from years of stone bedding. Your stomach twisted at the taste of real food. Your skin flinched at sudden touch. You heard chains in your sleep, screams in the wind. You bathed, but the filth stayed under your nails, in your soul. There were ex-prisoners who went mad within weeks. Others who wandered off into the forest, unable to stand the noise of life. Some became beggars, spat on by those who hadn't seen the inside of a cell. Others ended up right back where they started, rearrested for vagrancy, theft, or nothing at all. A few told their stories, wrote them down, but most didn't have the words, or the strength, or the audience, because no one really wanted to know what it was like. The truth was too ugly, too loud, too close to home. So, yes, you could survive the dungeon, but you never left it. It followed you, inside your bones, inside your dreams. It shaped your gait, your breath, your voice. You weren't a prisoner anymore. You were something worse. A reminder. If you're wondering when things changed, when the dungeon became something less hellish, more civilized, the answer is simple. They didn't. Not for a long, long time. Medieval prison reform wasn't a movement. It wasn't even a thought. The system didn't evolve. It endured. Centuries passed with little more than adjustments in architecture or uniform. The mindset remained. Prisons weren't for rehabilitation. They were for punishment, control, silence. In the 17th and 18th centuries, whispers of reform started to flicker. Enlightenment thinkers wrote essays. Clergy preached compassion. Philosophers questioned whether iron and fire really improved the soul. But those ideas were fragile things, easily drowned out by torches and screams. Most early reforms focused not on the conditions but on order. Better bookkeeping, more consistent punishments. The cells still stank. The torture chambers still opened. The food still rotted. But now it was more organized. It took revolutions, bloody, fire-lit ones, to force real changes. And even then, the changes were slow. The creation of penitentiaries. The end of torture as official policy. The first ideas of solitary confinement as reflection instead of slow death. But even into the 19th century, dungeons still existed. In castles, in back rooms, in colonies. Whips and branding irons didn't vanish. They just got quieter. And today, the chains are gone. The iron boots are museum pieces, but the echoes remain. Overcrowded cells, inhumane conditions, psychological torment. People still vanish, still wait for trials that never come, still scream into walls that don't answer. So, no, prison reform wasn't a medieval story. It was a modern one, born from the ashes of horror, written in the blood of the forgotten, and still unfinished. Because justice doesn't fix itself. It waits for someone to pry open the doors and ask, what's still happening in the dark? It's easy to compare the medieval dungeon to modern prisons and scoff, well, at least it's not like that anymore. And sure, most jails today don't chain you to a wall or let rats crawl into your wounds. But make no mistake, while the shackles may have changed shape, the shadows haven't vanished. They've just shifted. In the Middle Ages, prison was pain, hunger, silence. It was dark by design. You were guilty the moment someone said you were. You waited to die or to rot. There were no rights, no lawyers, no trials that meant anything. You were property, a problem to be buried underground and forgotten. Today, we have courtrooms, due process, judges, sentences. But the system still punishes more than it protects, still forgets more than it rehabilitates. Overcrowded cells, solitary confinement, underfunded care, justice shaped by class, race, and power. If you're rich, you leave quickly. If you're poor, you wait, and sometimes never leave at all. Modern jails have beds, lights, clean water, but they still break people. Not with torture racks, but with time, isolation, shame, systemic neglect. The architecture may be cleaner, the food marginally better, but for many, prison is still a warehouse for the unwanted. The same cold strategy: contain, control, discard. And for the unlucky, the experience can still feel medieval. Wrongful convictions, prison abuse, endless pretrial detentions, mental health crises ignored, guards who abuse with impunity, whole lives lost between paperwork and policy. So no, we don't live in castles with oubliettes anymore. But the ghosts of that time still walk among us. They're in the eyes of the inmate sleeping on the floor of an overcrowded cell, in the forgotten files, in the ignored pleas for appeal, in the scream that no one answers. Progress is not a straight line, and history doesn't stay buried, especially when the walls are built to keep it out of sight. So now you've made it. You've crawled through the darkness, through the filth, the torture, the chains. You've seen what a single day in a medieval dungeon looked like. And somehow, you're still here, breathing, blinking, watching. But the people who lived this, they didn't get to walk away, they didn't get to close the book. Their reality was your nightmare, and it didn't end at dawn. For them, surviving wasn't a blessing. It was the sentence. Because prison in the Middle Ages wasn't just about punishment. It was about erasure, taking a person and peeling them back until only the outline remained. No comfort, no rights, no rescue, just stone, hunger, screams, and time. Time that stretched into madness, into scars, into silence. And still, some of them held on. Through prayer, through hatred, through memory, through whatever tiny thread reminded them they were still human. That someone, somewhere, might still be looking for them. That hope, however ragged, was still possible. Those people mattered, even if their names were lost, even if their stories were buried beneath castles and dust. They were more than prisoners. They were survivors, witnesses, warnings. And if their pain echoes across time, it's not just to shock us, it's to remind us, this happened, this was real, And the next time someone disappears into a cell, into silence, we should listen. Because no one should suffer in the dark and be forgotten. Not then, not now.